My mother-in-law invited us to dinner at her estate, then offered me a receptionist job for $34K a year, still thinking I was just a poor warehouse worker who should feel lucky to sit at her table. She didn't know I owned 44% of her company, worth $1.6 billion. I stayed silent. Then my lawyer sent her an email, and everything changed. The folder landed on her dining table at 7:51 p.m. on a Thursday in November, and the sound it made, that clean, flat slap against $4,000 walnut, is something I will never stop hearing. Vivian Ashcombe didn't look at it right away. She looked at me, the way a woman looks at something that has no business existing in her house. Let me tell you what I was wearing that night. Dark trousers, a gray blazer I bought off the rack at a department store 9 years ago, a white dress shirt that Theo ironed himself because he said the dry cleaner always left a crease in the wrong place. My shoes were clean. My watch was a Casio I'd had since 2003. Nothing about me telegraphed a single thing Vivian Ashcombe would have recognized as success. That was the plan. It had always been the plan. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I've been getting ahead of myself my whole life. The warehouse floor teaches you to think 3 steps past the current moment. Because on the floor, the current moment will hurt you if you're not careful. You watch the forklift. You watch the forklift behind the forklift. You watch the loading bay in case something changes and you need to move. Vivian Ashcombe spent 31 years looking at me and seeing a warehouse worker. She wasn't entirely wrong. She just didn't see the rest of it. My name is Priya Sandhu. I grew up in Brampton, the third daughter of a machinist named Avtar Sandhu and a woman named Surinder who worked dispatch at a logistics company and somehow raised 3 girls without raising her voice more than twice a year. We were not poor the way people mean when they say the word dramatically. We were careful. Grocery store brand everything. Library cards instead of cable. My father drove the same Toyota pickup for 17 years and never once complained about it because he said a truck that runs is a truck that runs. I started in warehousing at 19, moved to Mississauga at 23 for a position at a mid-sized fulfillment center called Continental Logistics. It was loud, repetitive, and unglamorous. I was good at it. I was also quietly good at other things. I had started reading financial statements at 17 because my high school economics teacher, a retired actuary named Mrs. Whitlock, told me that the only difference between a person who works for money and a person who has money work for them is whether they bothered to learn the second language. I borrowed books from the library. I took night courses, not finance school. Night courses at a community college where the instructor was a tired chartered accountant named Devin, who taught us like we were adults with jobs, because we were adults with jobs. By the time I was 29, I had a small portfolio. Nothing spectacular, patient, methodical, boring. The warehouse paid the bills, the portfolio paid attention. I met Theo Ashcombe at a mutual friend's birthday party in 1996. He was 26. He had his mother's same sharp eyes and none of her arrogance. He laughed too loudly at his own jokes and apologized for it immediately, and I thought that was the most honest thing I'd ever seen a handsome man do. We talked for 3 hours about his job. He was a newly minted social studies teacher, and about books, and about his theory that the best index of a person's character was how they treated people in service roles. He'd been testing waiters and cab drivers his whole adult life, he said. I thought, this man will either love me or terrify me, possibly both. We were married in 1998, small ceremony at a community hall in Mississauga because that's what we could afford and we didn't pretend otherwise. My father gave a toast that made half the room cry. Theo's family attended with the collective body language of people who had been invited to a party they considered beneath their standards. Vivian's gift was a check for $2,000 and a handshake she completed while looking at something over my shoulder. I met Vivian Ashcombe properly in 1997 when Theo brought me to the Forest Hill house for Sunday dinner. She shook my hand at the front door, the one with the circular driveway, the mature elms lining the front walk, the limestone facade that had been power washed so recently you could still smell it, and she looked at my hand while she shook it, not at my face, my hand. She said, "So, you work at a warehouse?" I said, "Yes." She said, "And you see yourself doing that for the long term." It wasn't a question. She said it the way you say something when the answer doesn't matter, when you're simply establishing category. Working class. No university. No trajectory she recognized. She filed me under a heading and closed the drawer. Theo said, "Mom," in a voice I'd come to know very well over the next 3+ decades. A voice that meant, "Please stop. Please don't do this. Please, for once, just be decent." She never stopped. She never didn't do this. She was never, to my knowledge, simply decent. Over the years, I cataloged her methods the way you catalog a piece of equipment that has the potential to cause harm, not out of hatred, but out of professional necessity. There was the dinner table edition, deployed in front of an audience, a story about a warehouse worker she knew, told with the rueful generosity of a woman describing a limited species. There was the one-on-one edition, the quiet, carefully casual question about whether I'd thought about going back to school. There was the silent edition, the most corrosive one, where she simply looked at something I was wearing, or the car I was driving, or the house we lived in Vivian when the family photos came out and said nothing at all, just produced a small sound in the back of her throat that contained an entire assessment. I made a decision early in my marriage. I decided that Vivian Ashcombe's opinion of me was data. That was all it was. Data about Vivian Ashcombe. It told me nothing about myself that I didn't already know better than she ever would. And it told me a great deal about her that I stored carefully and used to understand what I was dealing with. What I was dealing with was a woman who had inherited a meaningful asset, grown it through genuine ability and excessive risk tolerance, and constructed an identity around that success so total that anything outside her known hierarchy was invisible to her. She wasn't evil. She was incurious. In my experience, incuriosity in a person of power does more sustained damage than malice, because malice at least acknowledges what it's destroying. Vivian couldn't destroy what she couldn't see. She couldn't see me. Ashcombe Industrial was Vivian's inheritance and her obsession. Her father had started it in the late 1950s with a handful of commercial warehouses along the Lakeshore corridor. Vivian had expanded it, aggressively, cleverly, and with a degree of risk tolerance that I recognized because I had a similar one, expressed differently. By the mid-90s, Ashcombe Industrial held a mix of commercial warehousing, logistics infrastructure, and a modest portfolio of light manufacturing holdings across southern Ontario. I started researching the company in 1999, not because I was plotting anything. I want to be clear about that. I researched it because Vivian owned it. Theo held a small stake in it through a family trust, and I'm the kind of person who researches what her family is connected to. Old warehouse training. Watch the forklift behind the forklift. What I found was a company with good bones and porous financial management. Vivian was a builder, not a numbers person. She trusted people who wore expensive suits and handed her optimistic projections. Her CFO at the time, a man named Bertrand Ngo, who always seemed to have a tan regardless of the season, had a flair for presentation and a casual relationship with due diligence. In 2001, Ashcombe Industrial needed to recapitalize. A major distribution facility in Vaughan had gone sideways, not catastrophically, but expensively. Vivian went to her usual lenders first. Her usual lenders were suddenly cautious. The post-9/11 market was making everyone cautious. I was watching. I had, by 2001, quietly assembled a holding company I called Sandhu Capital Limited. Nothing on the letterhead would suggest it was operated by a woman who drove a 2003 Corolla and brought her lunch to work in a thermos. That was also deliberate. I had engaged a corporate lawyer named Vikram Oduya. He had an office above a print shop on Eglinton and charged half of what the Bay Street firms charged and was twice as careful. And we structured Sandhu Capital to hold interests through a numbered company, with my name appearing only in the beneficial ownership records required by securities regulators. In 2005, Ashcombe Industrial needed capital again. This time, the gap was larger. I offered it, not directly. Sandhu Capital made an approach through an intermediary, a financial advisory firm that Vikram had connections with, reputable, low profile. The terms were reasonable. The equity stake being offered was significant. Vivian, who had been turned down twice by institutional lenders that year, accepted. She accepted without fully reading what she was signing. I know this because Vikram, who was meticulous, flagged the possibility, and we discussed whether to slow the process down. We decided not to. The disclosure documents were clear. The beneficial ownership would be registered with the OSC as required by law. If Vivian chose not to examine who she was getting into bed with, that was Vivian's decision. 44% of Ashcombe Industrial, in exchange for a capital injection of $13 million, passed to Sandhu Capital Limited in October of 2005. I was sitting at my desk at the warehouse when Vikram called me to confirm the filing. I said thank you and went back to watching the doc. People sometimes ask, when I eventually tell this story, why I didn't say anything for 20 years. Why I sat at that dining table every Christmas and every Easter and every family birthday and let Vivian treat me like a charity case she'd been saddled with through no fault of her own. The honest answer has several layers. The first layer is Theo. He loved his mother with a complicated love, the kind you develop when someone is simultaneously your hero and your wound. He had navigated that tension his entire life. I wasn't going to detonate it. Not unless I had to. The second layer is that I genuinely did not need Vivian to know. The dividends came quarterly. The company performed. Vivian's expansions, the ones she crowed about at the dinner table, the Niagara distribution hub, the Steeles Avenue mixed-use project, the Etobicoke manufacturing portfolio, all of it performed, and all of it paid me. I drove a modest car and worked the warehouse floor because I was good at it and it paid my benefits and it was honest work. And because honestly, I liked it. I'd always liked it. Avtar Sandhu's daughter was never going to be embarrassed about working with her hands. The third layer is the one I don't always tell people because it sounds cold. I was watching the forklift behind the forklift. Desmond Ashcombe, Vivian's son, Theo's older brother, had been working at Ashcombe Industrial since his mid-20s. He was good-looking in the way of men who've never had to develop a personality. He had his mother's certainty without his mother's intelligence, and over the years I watched him make decisions inside the company that I found professionally alarming. Cost-cutting that prioritized the quarterly number over the asset quality. 2 distribution facilities in Brampton with deferred maintenance that I knew, through my quarterly board board materials as a silent stakeholder were going to become serious problems. Desmond was being groomed. I was watching him be groomed. I was waiting to understand what that meant for Theo. The succession dinner answered that question. The dinner was Vivian's idea. She called it a family gathering. Roderick, her husband, a man who communicated primarily through pointed silences and strategic changes of subject, had set the table with the good china, which was always a sign that something formal was happening. We drove up to Forest Hill on a Thursday evening. Theo wore a navy suit he'd bought for a work function the previous spring. Naomi, our daughter, came directly from her office. She's a social worker with a children's aid agency, has been for 8 years, and she dresses accordingly. Practical, professional, perpetually underpaid by roughly 40% relative to her actual skill set. Naomi and I have always understood each other. We sat down. Roderick served the salad. The conversation had the stiff quality of a meeting disguised as a meal. Then Vivian set down her fork and announced the succession plan. Desmond would receive 58% of the company outright through a restructured share transfer, effective in 18 months, triggered by Vivian's planned retirement at 67. Roderick would retain the family residence and a comfortable income through the remaining holdco structure. Theo, one who had never asked for anything from his mother in his life, who had built a 20-year career as a high school department head entirely on his own, would receive 6%. Not because that was all that was available, because that was all Vivian deemed appropriate for the son who had married beneath the family's expectations. Naomi would receive a one-time cash gift of $45,000. Vivian described this with the word thoughtful. I looked at Naomi. Her hands went flat on the table in front of her. She was 30 years old. She worked 60-hour weeks helping children survive dangerous homes, and her grandmother had just given her a cash tip like she was the valet at her club. I looked at Theo. His jaw was trembling. I had watched that jaw tremble at more Ashcombe dinners than I could count. I had held his hand under the table 100 times while he swallowed it. He was always swallowing it because he was the peacekeeper. He was the one who believed that maintaining the relationship was worth the indignity, that one day she would come around, that love was patient the way the Bible said it was. That jaw trembling was the end of my patience, not the plan itself, not 31 years of contempt, his jaw. Then Vivian looked at me. She had saved me for last. That one day she would come around, that love was patient the way the Bible said it was. That jaw trembling was the end of my patience, not the plan itself, not 31 years of contempt, his jaw. Then Vivian looked at me. She had saved me for last. She said she'd been thinking about my situation. She said that at my age, and I was 60, it wasn't easy to transition out of the trades. She said that Ashcombe Industrial had an opening in front office administration, entry level, $34,000 a year, reporting to a man named Desmond. Punctuality is important, she said. Desmond smiled. It was the smile of a man who has never once considered that other people have interior lives. I sat quietly for 4 seconds. I know it was 4 seconds because I counted them. I'll have to decline, I said. The table went very still. Excuse me, Vivian said. I'm not interested. She went through the color progression that I'd always privately called the Ashcombe spectrum. Pale, then pink, then the particular high red of genuine outrage. You worked in a warehouse for 30 years. You have no skills, no prospects. I am offering you a lifeline. A lifeline implies I'm drowning, I said. I'm not, she laughed. The theatrical laugh, the one she used when she wanted the room on her side. My friends laugh when I tell them my son married a warehouse worker. You understand that? They laugh. Out loud. Theo started to stand. I put my hand on his gently. Not yet. I reached into my jacket. No phone, no tablet. Nothing that could be dismissed as something assembled in the moment. Paper, clean white pages, crisp edges, a legal-size folder held together with a single binder clip. I had picked it up from Vikram Oduya's office that morning. Vikram had said when he handed it to me, "You sure you want to do this Thursday?" And I had said yes. And he had nodded the way Vikram always nodded when he'd already anticipated the answer. I set the folder on the table. I slid it across the walnut toward Vivian. She stared at it. For a moment, she actually didn't move. Then she opened it. The first page was a beneficial ownership disclosure filed that morning with the Ontario Securities Commission. OSC filings are public documents. Anyone can look them up. The filing confirmed that Sandhu Capital Limited held a 44% beneficial interest in Ashcombe Industrial Holdings Corporation. The second page was a share registry extract. Current, certified. The third page was the beneficial ownership declaration from the original 2005 transaction, with the numbered company traced through to its registered owner, my name. The room produced a sound I'd never heard at that table before, which was nothing at all, not even the sound of breathing. Vivian's eyes moved across the page, once. Slowly, she went back to the top, read it again. Sandhu Capital, she said. The words came out like she was translating something from a language she didn't speak. Mine, I said. I let that sit for exactly 3 seconds. I've been your largest single shareholder since October 2005, I said. The Bentley in your driveway was purchased in a year when my dividends from this company were $230,000. Your 2017 refinancing, the one that gave you the liquidity to start the Steeles Avenue project, was approved through a lending facility that Sandhu Capital co-sponsored. Every expansion you've announced at this table in the past 20 years was capitalized in part by my firm. I have attended no board meetings. I have asked for nothing. I have simply held my position and collected what was owed. Desmond grabbed the folder. His hands were shaking. His mother had let go of it without seeming to notice. "You're a warehouse worker," Desmond said. I said. "I'm also your company's largest external shareholder. I own more of this company than your mother is transferring to you." Roderick made a sound I can only describe as the sound of a person's mental model of the world beginning to fail structurally. Theo was crying, not weeping, not sobbing. Tears running down his face, silent, his hands still and flat on the table, not wiping them away. He looked at me the way you look at someone when you realize you knew them, and also you didn't know them at all, and somehow both of those things are true and fine. Naomi looked at me from across the table. Something flickered in her eyes that I recognized because it was Avtar Sandhu's expression on a 30-year-old woman's face. She gave me the faintest nod. I reached over and took the folder from Desmond's hands with no particular force. I set it back on the table in front of Vivian, positioned carefully so she could see both names, hers and mine. Vivian Ashcombe sat at the head of her walnut table with her mouth open and her face the color of old chalk. The queen who had just discovered that her kingdom had a co-owner she'd been laughing at for 31 years. Her phone buzzed on the table. She didn't move to answer it. It buzzed again. She looked down at the screen. Whatever she saw there, I already knew what it was, because Vikram had sent the email at 7:50 p.m., 60 seconds before the folder hit the table, drained whatever remained of her composure in a single quiet moment. "Who else did you tell?" she whispered. I straightened my jacket. "Read the email," I said, and I stood up and I walked out. The email Vikram sent at 7:50 p.m. had gone to 4 addresses: Vivian's personal account, her corporate account, Desmond's corporate account, and, at my specific instruction, the email address of Geraldine Foss, Ashcombe Industrial's longtime corporate solicitor, and a woman who had, in my estimation, enabled years of cavalier governance practices without complaint. The email introduced Vikram Oduya, listed his credentials: 23 years in corporate law, formerly of a well-regarded Bay Street firm, current principal of Oduya Corporate Law, and formally notified the recipients that Sandhu Capital Limited was exercising its right as a major shareholder to request a full independent audit of Ashcombe Industrial's financial records for the preceding 5 fiscal years, pursuant to the shareholders' agreement signed in 2005 and the applicable sections of the Business Corporations Act. It also noted that, given the recent succession announcement and the proposed share transfers to Desmond Ashcombe, Sandhu Capital would be filing a formal objection with the OSC pending review of whether the proposed restructuring adequately protected minority and significant stake shareholder interests. It was not a threat. Everything in it was entirely legal and proper. It was simply paper. Clean white paper. The kind that takes years to prepare and seconds to detonate. I want to tell you about the drive home. Theo held my hand the whole way. He didn't say anything for the first 15 minutes. The city moved past the windows, wet and orange lit from the November drizzle, and I drove and he held my hand and Naomi sat in the back seat looking at her phone. Eventually, Naomi said, "When did you know?" "Know what?" I said. "That you were going to do it tonight. I thought about that. When your grandmother set out the good china," I said. "That was when I called Vikram." Naomi made a sound that might have been a laugh. Theo said, "Priya." I said, "Yes." He said, 20 years. I said, "Yes." He said, "The Bentley." I said, "Yes." He was quiet for another minute. Then he said, "I want to hear all of it. Everything. Every year. I want you to sit across from me at our kitchen table and tell me everything." I said, "I'll make the tea." He had retained, as outside support, 2 specialists: Helena Petrov, a forensic accountant with 18 years of experience in closely held corporations, and Samuel Okoye, a senior associate at a securities law firm who had spent 7 years at the OSC before going into private practice, and who understood how regulators thought because he had been one. Samuel was the one who had walked me through the decision, in August, about timing the OSC filing. We met in Vikram's office, the one above the print shop, on a Thursday afternoon, papers covering every inch of the conference table. Samuel had a yellow legal pad and a habit of writing things down in a precise block print that made his notes look like they'd been typeset. "The beneficial ownership was always required to be disclosed," he said, pushing his glasses up. "You've been compliant every year. What you're doing now is not pulling a trigger. You're simply stopping the act of being silent." I said, "There's a difference." "There's a large difference," Samuel said. "Legally and morally." He laid out the regulatory mechanism. The OSC filing, which I'd been doing annually as required, would be updated with a current certification. Nothing unusual about that. The novelty would be the letter accompanying it, formally notifying Ashcombe Industrial's corporate solicitor of the filing and of Sandhu Capital's intent to be actively rather than passively engaged as a stakeholder going forward. That letter, Samuel explained, was what would trip every alarm in Geraldine Foss's carefully appointed office, because it signaled a shift from patient capital to engaged capital, and Geraldine Foss was experienced enough to understand what that meant. What it means, Samuel said, is that the game changes. What it means, I said, is that they see the board. Samuel looked at me over his glasses. Then he wrote something on his legal pad. He turned it around so I could read it. It said, exactly. Helena Petrov's preliminary review of the financial records took 6 weeks. She worked from the documents I had access to through the shareholders' agreement, quarterly statements, capital expenditure schedules, related party transaction disclosures. She was thorough in the way of someone who has sat across from too many defendants in legal proceedings who thought they had been thorough and turned out not to have been. Her findings were not criminal. I want to be clear about that. Vivian was not a fraudster. What she was, what Helena documented in a 108-page report, was a woman who had run a company of considerable size with the governance standards of a much smaller family business. Related party transactions inadequately disclosed. Deferred maintenance liabilities not properly reflected on the books. A compensation structure for senior management, which included Desmond, that bore no visible relationship to any performance benchmarks Helena could identify. The Brampton properties I had been watching for years, they showed up in Helena's report on page 51, flagged as representing potential undisclosed liabilities of between $9 and $15 million. Helena called me when she'd completed the draft report. She said, Ms. Santu, this is a cleanable situation. None of this is beyond repair, but it needed someone to say it out loud. I said, that's what we're doing. She said, yes, that's what we're doing. Desmond had signed off on the Brampton valuations. His signature was on the documents. We did not go to the police. There was nothing to take to the police. What we had was paper. Properly organized, properly interpreted paper. We took it to Geraldine Foss first as a professional courtesy. I had never disliked Geraldine. I thought she was a woman who had looked away from things she should have looked at, which is different from actively doing wrong, and I wanted to give her the opportunity to respond appropriately. Vikram and I met with Geraldine at her office on Bay Street on a Tuesday morning in December. Vikram laid out Helena's preliminary findings. Geraldine's face did something complicated over about 30 seconds, cycling through responses, defensive, then calculating, then finally a species of exhaustion. She said, what do you want? Vikram said, a seat at the table, a proper board, independent directors, financial statements that reflect reality. Geraldine said, and Vivian? Vikram said, that's Vivian's decision to make. She can participate in a properly governed company, or she can exit at fair value. Both options are available to her. Geraldine said she needed time. Vikram said she had 2 weeks. Geraldine came back in 10 days. I will tell you what Vivian did and did not do. She did not apologize. I did not expect her to. A woman who has spent 31 years constructing a particular view of the world does not disassemble it in 10 days. She would not have been capable of it, and I honestly did not need it. What she did was agree to a restructured governance arrangement. A proper board, 3 independent directors, Helena Petrov herself accepted a seat, which I had hoped for, and a revised set of financial disclosures that corrected the Brampton situation before it became someone else's problem. The succession was modified. Desmond would not receive 58% of anything until the audit was complete and the books were clean, which we estimated at 18 months minimum. Theo's 6% became 20% under the restructuring, reflecting the fair value of what he had always, by right and by law, been owed as a family stakeholder. Naomi received a proper allocation from the family trust, not a tip, an allocation. Specific, documented, and tied to real asset value. I retained my 44%. I have attended 3 board meetings since November. I sit at a long table in a boardroom on King Street with independent directors and a CFO who replaced Bertrand Ngo 18 months ago, and an agenda that gets followed because there are now people in the room whose job it is to follow it. Vivian attends as founder and advisor. She sits at the other end of the table. She has not offered me a job. I went back to the warehouse in December. I still had 6 months left before I was planning to retire anyway, and I finished them. I am my father's daughter. A truck that runs is a truck that runs. My last day at the warehouse, a man named Calvin, who had worked the dock beside me for 13 years, gave me a handshake and said, "What are you gonna do with yourself, Priya?" I said, "Board meetings, mostly." He laughed. He thought I was joking. I thought about explaining it. I decided against it. Some things work better as paper. Theo and I sat at our kitchen table the night after the Forest Hill dinner until 2 in the morning. I made the tea. I told him everything, in order, from the night courses with Devon to the call from Vikram in October 2005 to the conversation in July when I decided that the succession announcement would be the moment. He asked good questions. Careful, organized questions. The kind a department head asks when he's actually trying to understand something and not just react to it. At one point he said, "Were you ever going to tell me?" I thought about that for a long time. Long enough that he started to say something else, and I held up my hand. "Yes," I said. I was waiting for the right time. I kept thinking there would be a clear moment, a point where it would make sense to say it. He said, "And?" I said, "She manufactured the moment for me." He was quiet. Then he laughed. It was the laugh from the birthday party in 1996, the one that was too loud and he didn't apologize for this time. That woman, he said, has done one useful thing in her life. I poured us both more tea. Naomi texted at 11 p.m. You should know I've been smiling since 7:51. Love you, Mom. 6 months later, it was a Tuesday in May, warm enough to have the windows open. I got a call from Geraldine Foss. She was calling on behalf of the board, formally, to let me know that the independent audit was complete, the Brampton liabilities had been resolved through a negotiated sale at reasonable terms, and that the company's restated financials had been filed with no regulatory action. She said, the company is in good shape. I said, good, she said, after a pause. Vivian asked me to pass along that she started again. She said to tell you that she read the email. I sat with that for a moment. Tell her I know, I said. I hung up and sat for a while looking out the window at the neighbor's garden, which was coming in nicely. Theo was in the kitchen making lunch. The radio was on. Through the window, I could see the old Casio watch on my wrist catching the light. I thought about Vivian Ashcombe sitting at the head of that walnut table, in the particular silence of a woman discovering that the furniture has been watching her all along. I thought about Naomi's hands flat on the table. I thought about Theo's jaw. 31 years, not one of them wasted.